So the latest in conference realignment. We told you last weekend about Florida State. Well, now Florida State is starting to yap a little bit. Florida State's starting to talk a little bit. Florida State's starting to say, hey, you know what? We're going to have our voice heard. We're going to talk a little bit to the media, most notably ESPN. It is not a coincidence that the people that matter, like Florida State Athletic Director Michael Alford, has decided he is going to take his message of dissatisfaction with the ACC to ESPN. That's not a coincidence. That's not by mistake. That's not because he was bored one day and decided, I'm going to go out there and talk to ESPN and, have a word to say to Pete Thamel about, conference realignment and our dissatisfaction with the ACC. No. This is a coordinated effort is what is going on here. So in this big piece that was done by ESPN, Michael Alford did, in fact, speak to, and it wasn't Pete Thamel, it was Andrea Adelson and David Hale. And part of what he said regarding Florida State, its future in the ACC, was the following. He said, quote, at the end of the day, if something's not done, we cannot be $30 million behind every year compared to our peers. Alford's talking about the SEC and the Big Ten. He also said, quote, I know how hard the commissioner and the office are working to provide solutions to the members of the conference to the revenue gap that we are projecting in the upcoming years with the media contracts. But at the end of the day, in order to compete to the standard we want to compete in, there needs to be a change, and the status quo is not good enough. That is Florida State Athletic Director Michael Alford directly telling the ACC through ESPN, you better do something or we're done. You better do something or we are out of this league. Sayonara, see you later. We'll see you in the SEC, the Big Ten, or dare I say the Big 12. Now, some of you mocked me for the thought that Florida State would ever consider the Big 12. I don't think that's crazy. I'm not convinced that the SEC would want to add Florida State and Clemson because at some point the SEC gets to the point of diminishing returns. Someone's got to finish in last place in that league on the football field. And for Florida State's sake, they may say if we can get more money and more visibility and be in a conference that cares a lot more about football, but also is darn good at basketball like the Big 12, and maybe get an unequal portion of revenue, why not consider that? And many of you knocked me for it and said, we just got rid of Oklahoma and Texas. We don't want somebody else who thinks they're better. I don't either. I love this league through and through. This is the league I care about the most. This is why I do this. But I'm also willing to sit here and have the conversation and say, you know what? Sometimes extenuating circumstances call for an ability to think outside the box and be creative. And not that I want some Florida State Seminole AD or president, swinging the big stick and thinking he's, top dog necessarily. But if it's good for the entire league, and if it lifts everybody up to some degree, it's at least worth exploring. I don't think you shut the door because if Florida State does bail in the ACC with Clemson, then you are just going to have, and if they go to the SEC or the Big Ten, the gap between the Power 2 and everybody else will grow. And the Big 12's goal right now has got to be to make sure that the gap between them, the SEC, and the Big Ten does not get any larger than it is right now. The revenue gap, the talent gap, the recruiting gap, the facilities gap. I'll be the first one to tell you. It's the SEC, it's the Big Ten, and then there's, a drop-off, but the Big 12, I believe, is solidly in that third position. They've got to make sure that the difference between them and the Big Ten and the SEC is not getting larger. Ideally, it shrinks, but it can't get larger. Because if it gets larger, then you find yourself in a position where, it's basically two power conferences and a bunch of group of fives. Or group of whatever they're going to be at that point, group of 8. I mean, you don't want that. So I'm with you. I don't want somebody coming in and pushing everybody else around, but I'm also willing to admit that if it means it prevents Florida State from potentially joining the SEC or the Big Ten, if those invites aren't there and the money's not where they want it to be, you got to consider it. You have to be smart about this. You have to be forward-thinking about this. And I firmly believe that Brett Yormark in the Big 12 will be smart about that. So here's what Commissioner Jim Phillips, ACC Commissioner Jim Phillips, also told ESPN in this piece. He said, none of the concerns that were shared during the meeting regarding the one with Florida State and Clemson were things that we haven't already been looking at and addressing as a conference. We've been open about our league's discussion on revenue generation and business innovation, and we've been exploring all options to enhance overall revenue. That is from their commissioner, Jim Phillips. He's basically saying we know that to some degree, Florida State and Clemson, have us by the short hairs here, in the best way to put it. Jim Phillips gets that. He's not a dumb guy. He sees what's going on in the Pac-12. He sees the mess that is George Kliakov's Pac-12 right now. I mean, that thing is bursting at the seams. That is one domino away from collapsing out there on the West Coast. It's horrible right now, the Pac-12. I don't care what John Canzano or Wiln or any of those guys, whatever they have to say. It is on the verge of collapse. And Phillips knows that he can't afford that to happen in his league. He doesn't want that to happen in his league. He's got to be creative. But the fascinating part of the story is not just what's being said, right? But it's also that it's going public. It's also about who's saying it. It's also about the fact that Florida State's being so vocal. They're not just leaking these reports out to the media. They're talking directly to the media about it. That means they're serious. That means they're not messing around, and that means that the ACC's got to move. If not, somebody else is going to do it. Now, if you look at what other athletic directors have said, one AD said anonymously, quote, philosophically, I believe that what's good for one should be good for everyone. Otherwise, you get a lot of disparity. The big thing is if you're making an extra $2 million because you went to the college football playoff, if you get asked to be in another league like UCLA and USC did, it doesn't matter. That's not going to change your decision. They're gone, so it's not preventing what people are kind of concerned about, which is if there was continued super expansion, people are gone. The AD says if you create those types of models within your own conference, are you really looking out for what's best for the Big Ten or the ACC or fill in the blank? Or are you looking out for what's best for you? Well, I hate to break it to that AD, but college sports is a zero-sum game. College sports is a dog-eat-dog world. There are X amount of teams. Those teams are not growing. We're not adding new teams. If a league steals a team, that helps that league and that hurts the league that it got stolen from. So that AD is living in some la-la land communist utopia that he's created in his own mind. That's not the world of college sports today, and I don't like that. Let me be very clear as well. I miss the amateurism feel of college sports. It doesn't feel like that anymore. There's good reasons for that to be the case because I like capitalism. I want people to make the money that they're worth, but I also, long for the days of a little more of an amateurism feel. But that's over. You can either pretend like that matters, or you can admit that that's not the way of today, and it's not the way of the future. So that AD, I would just tell him to basically get with the times, my man. Get with the times. Eesh.